Have you ever wondered why so many child stars seem to soar to unimaginable heights, only to crash back down just as quickly? It might look glamorous to be on magazine covers and to have all eyes on you, but the reality of that spotlight, especially when you're still just a kid, can be devastating. There's pressure from producers to deliver perfect performances, pressure from agents to always be on your best behavior, pressure from fans to live up to an impossible image, and pressure from so-called friends who might lure you toward bad decisions at high-profile parties. In the 1970s, one of the most iconic examples of the highs and lows of teenage stardom was Leif Garrett. His baby face and golden hair appeared on countless covers of teen magazines. He had music deals, film roles, adoring fans, everything people dream of when they imagine making it in Hollywood. And yet beneath the veneer of teenage dreams, there was darkness brewing, loneliness, confusion, and the beginnings of an addiction that would haunt him for decades. Even now, when people look back at the teen idol phenomenon of the 70s, they remember the bright lights and the catchy songs, but they also remember the haunting stories of young actors being exposed to drugs and endless partying before they could even vote. If you needed proof of how quickly it can all slip away, Leif Garrett's story is about as clear as it gets. Leif Garrett's journey epitomizes the roller coaster ride that so many child actors experience. He was born in Hollywood to parents who were already connected to the entertainment industry. His father, Rick Nervick, wasn't particularly present, but his mother, Carolyn Steller, had a background in acting, which allowed Leif to start making television appearances when he was only 5 years old. By many accounts, he wasn't just a cute face. He was academically gifted, graduating high school at the age of 15. This combination of talent and intelligence might make you think he was perfectly poised for a stable and successful career. After all, plenty of child actors who start early, like Jodie Foster or Ron Howard, do manage to transition into adulthood with their reputations intact. But Garrett was not so lucky, and his story underlines how volatile the path of a teenage star can be. According to sources like Rolling Stone and interviews on television talk shows in the late 70s, Leif Garrett was set up by managers and labels to be the next big heartthrob, much like David Cassidy before him. The trouble was, behind that glossy image, there was mounting despair. Before we dive into the whirlwind of scandals, legal trouble, and heartbreak, it's important to see just how promising his life was at first. He began snagging roles in various television shows and small films in the early 70s. By the time he was a teen, his face was already recognizable to audiences. He starred alongside his sister Dawn Lynn in Devil Times 5, a low-budget horror movie sometimes known under other titles like People Toys. Though it wasn't a blockbuster, it showcased Garrett's ability to handle dramatic material. Around that same time, he appeared in shows like Gunsmoke, Family, and Wonder Woman, occasionally in small guest roles that allowed him to sharpen his skills. While it's true that many child actors have trouble juggling school with set schedules, Garrett seemed to handle it well, even completing high school early. Then came the real explosion of fame. Teenage girls across the country discovered him, and he was thrust into the teen magazine circuit. His likeness became a mainstay in Tiger Beat, 16, and other youth-oriented publications, where he was heralded as the new teen idol. He signed a 5-album deal with Atlantic Records while still in his mid-teens, releasing his debut album in 1977. The record, simply titled Leif Garrett, included a cover of the song Come Back When You Grow Up, which immediately found an audience among radio listeners who couldn't get enough of Garrett's breezy pop style and boyish looks. Yet for all the screaming fans and relentless media attention, there was a storm brewing. Garrett later shared in interviews and in his autobiography, Idle Truth, that the real issue wasn't just fame, it was fame without guidance. Child actors often have a team of adults around them, agents, publicists, sometimes protective parents. But not all these adults have the young performer's best interests at heart. Garrett found himself surrounded by pressure. Record labels wanted hits. Publicists wanted marketable stories. Magazines wanted juicy interviews. And being a teen idol meant he always had to maintain a certain image in public. Smiling, approachable, carefree. He had to sing certain songs that he later admitted he didn't even like. He felt his music was too derivative, as if the record companies were just forcing him to sing radio-friendly covers to capitalize on his teen star status. This might all sound typical of a teen idol's life. After all, many teenage stars, Donny Osmond for instance, have spoken about feeling a loss of creative control. But Garrett's situation was made worse by something else entirely: drugs. According to what he has disclosed, he started experimenting when he was just 14. This time period, the mid-70s, was rife with drug use in Hollywood. Studio parties were brimming with stimulants, psychedelics, and alcohol. Many child actors, trying to fit in with older co-stars or producers, fell victim to the temptation. Some turned to drugs as a way to deal with the endless working hours, to cope with stress and maintain energy. Others, like Garrett, were simply offered drugs in social situations and quickly found themselves hooked. His story mirrors that of several other young actors from the 70s and 80s. Corey Feldman, Corey Haim, Todd Bridges, Dana Plato, where the glitz of Hollywood masked a darker underbelly of drug abuse. The tabloids of that era hungrily devoured these scandals, but the general public rarely knew the full extent of their struggles. It was only much later, through talk shows or autobiographies, that the grim details came to light. Garrett, even as he was enjoying a surge of popularity with his music career, had already planted the seeds of his own downfall. By the time he was 17, he had become a household name. His records sold well. He appeared on popular talk shows and variety specials. In the 1980s, he shifted his focus back to acting, starring in films like Cheerleader Camp, Party Line, and Thunder Alley. Teenagers who had grown up listening to his music flocked to see him in these movies. On the surface, Garrett's life seemed fantastic. He was making money, living in Los Angeles, surrounded by fans, and continuing to land new opportunities. But his struggle with drugs never really went away. In fact, it was intensifying. Then right before his 18th birthday, everything changed in a single night. That night, Garrett attended a late party with his friend Roland Winkler. Both were drinking, and Garrett was also under the influence of another illegal substance, according to toxicology reports. His blood alcohol level turned out to be roughly 3 times the legal limit. It's the kind of poor decision that, tragically, many young people make, getting behind the wheel of a car while impaired. But in Garrett's case, the cost was unimaginably high. On their way to purchase more drugs, Garrett lost control and crashed his mother's car, leaving Roland Winkler paralyzed from the waist down. The accident would forever alter both of their lives. Winkler eventually sued Garrett, and while the details of the settlement aren't the stuff of headlines anymore, the emotional fallout was massive. In interviews years later, Garrett admitted that the guilt and shame of what happened that night weighed on him heavily, contributing to an even deeper sense of self-loathing. At first, it might have looked like the public would forgive him. He was barely an adult, and tragic car accidents happen among young people who don't fully understand the severity of drunk driving. Garrett's fans, desperate to keep seeing him on stage or on screen, were relatively forgiving, even though news outlets covered the accident extensively. For a little while, he was able to continue his career. That same year, He had signed his record deal and released his debut album. The teen magazines still put him on covers, though their tone had shifted to a more sympathetic angle. Leif Garrett, the troubled idol. If he had managed to keep his life together moving forward, perhaps he would have been able to maintain his career momentum. But the lure of drugs was too strong, and his personal demons would only grow. Garrett has spoken about feeling that his music career lacked authenticity. He felt the record labels were pushing a style onto him that he didn't fully connect with. Still, teen girls in the late 70s and early 80s adored him, sending him fan mail by the truckload. He had a large following in Japan as well, where the teen idol phenomenon was especially intense. He was booked on variety shows, asked to pose for countless photo spreads, and made appearances at music festivals. All the while, he was battling addiction and emotional turmoil behind the scenes. His father wasn't around much during this time, so he had no real paternal guidance. His mother, while supportive, was also juggling her own roles and obligations. Hollywood is a tough place for parents to navigate if they're not intimately connected with the industry's more dangerous undercurrents. In the midst of this chaos, Garrett tried to find solace in romantic relationships. He dated several high-profile actresses. One of his most famous relationships was with Nicolette Sheridan, who would later star in Knots Landing and Desperate Housewives. By Garrett's own admission, he was jealous and possessive, and the relationship eventually fell apart. He also dated Tatum O'Neal, herself a child star famously thrust into the spotlight after winning an Oscar at age 10, and Justine Bateman, another actress who experienced fame at a young age through the sitcom Family Ties. None of these relationships lasted. The breakup with Sheridan in particular seemed to leave Garrett in a worse emotional state, and heartbreak fueled further drug use. Relationship flares up in the tabloids, then fizzles out, became part of the narrative swirling around him, which only contributed to his sense of isolation. He once remarked in an interview that he felt everything was too big, too loud, too soon, and that he barely had room to breathe. As the 80s transitioned into the 90s, Garrett's struggles with addiction became even more public. In 1997, he was arrested for possession of cocaine. By this point, the forgiving attitudes of the press and his fan base had begun to wane. During the 90s, the tabloids were merciless, chasing down celebrities who fell off the wagon or displayed erratic behavior. Paparazzi culture was booming, fueled by the rise of sensationalist TV shows like Hard Copy and Inside Edition. So when Garrett was arrested for trying to buy drugs from an undercover police officer in 1999, the headlines were brutal. It wasn't just a footnote anymore, it was a string of repeat offenses. Another child star, once beloved, was now just fodder for the tabloids. The media painted him as a has-been, a cautionary tale, a prime example of youthful promise squandered by bad decisions. In that harsh environment, it's no surprise that Garrett spiraled further. Between legal fees, court-ordered rehab stints, and ongoing substance abuse, Garrett's finances took a nosedive. He had already faced costly legal battles with Roland Winkler, and the repeated arrests made it nearly impossible to secure steady, lucrative work. His struggles were not unique. Many child actors have found themselves bankrupt after years of mishandling money, combined with the decline in job offers that often comes with scandal. But seeing it happen to someone who had once been a major teen icon was a stark reminder of how fleeting fame can be, especially in Hollywood. By the time the 2000s arrived, Garrett was almost entirely out of the public eye. He popped up occasionally on reality shows or in small cameo appearances, but the golden boy from the 70s was a distant memory. During the 2000s, Garrett made attempts at sobriety. He checked into rehabilitation centers more than once. In 2010, he briefly appeared on Celebrity Rehab with Dr. Drew, a show on VH1 that aimed to document the recovery journeys of famous individuals dealing with addiction. While some viewers criticized the program for sensationalizing the struggles of celebrities, others pointed out that it at least shed light on the genuine difficulties of fighting addiction. Garrett's participation was short-lived, and the general consensus was that he was still deeply entrenched in his personal battles. Public reactions range from sympathy to cynicism, with some people arguing that once a child star has been in the tabloids for drug use multiple times, it becomes hard to take new rehab attempts seriously. Nonetheless, the show gave insight into just how serious Garrett's struggles were. He talked openly about guilt, shame, and the feeling that his life had not been his own since he was a child. For a long time, it looked as though Garrett would fade into obscurity, joining the ranks of forgotten teen idols who never escaped their own demons. However, he did manage to reemerge in an unexpected way by penning his autobiography, Idle Truth, which was released in 2019. In that book, he painted a nuanced picture of what it was like to grow up in front of cameras, to navigate the entertainment machine at such a vulnerable age, and to lose oneself in drugs and alcohol. He didn't shy away from the darker details, the car crash that paralyzed his friend, the controlling nature of the record labels, the constant legal troubles. But he also offered a glimpse of remorse and responsibility, acknowledging that while many factors contributed to his downfall, he had made his own choices. The book itself garnered some attention from longtime fans, curious onlookers, and reporters interested in the behind-the-scenes reality of the 70s teen idol craze. According to various interviews promoting Idle Truth, Garrett expressed a desire to make music on his own terms. He said he still had a passion for performing, and that he wanted to craft songs that felt authentic to him, rather than the polished, prepackaged pop covers of his youth. By then, in his late 50s, Garrett believed he had enough life experience to sing honestly about struggle and redemption, about loss and the quest for second chances. He mentioned he had written some new material, which he hoped to release independently, free from the constraints of major labels that, in his words, didn't care about me as an artist, only as a product. There was a quiet sense of optimism there, the kind that comes from someone who has spent decades wrestling with personal turmoil and is just now finding his footing. Garrett's story isn't just about one man's missteps and attempts at redemption. It's also a broader commentary on how we treat child celebrities, especially those who rise to fame at a breakneck pace. Numerous articles from outlets like The Hollywood Reporter and Vanity Fair have analyzed the structural issues within the entertainment industry: long work hours for minors, a lack of mental health resources, a party culture brimming with temptations, and an almost predatory interest in sensational stories by gossip magazines. Drew Barrymore, for example, entered rehab at 13 after becoming addicted to alcohol and drugs in the 80s. Macaulay Culkin famously retreated from Hollywood to avoid being devoured by the same forces that turned him into a superstar. In Garrett's case, these industry pressures collided with personal vulnerabilities: a father who wasn't present, insecurities about his own creativity, and a sudden wave of fame that he wasn't mature enough to handle. The discussion also extends to how society deals with drug abuse, especially among celebrities. Too often, arrests and mugshots become front-page news, leading to shaming and finger-pointing rather than an understanding that addiction is a disease. The tabloids thrive on the downfall of stars. There's a certain voyeuristic pleasure some people get from watching icons stumble. Meanwhile, the legal system often opts for punitive measures rather than providing the support and rehabilitation that individuals fighting substance abuse actually need. Garrett's multiple arrests are a tragic example of this cycle. Every time he had a run-in with the law, he'd be dragged through the mud in headlines, compounding his feelings of shame and isolation, which frequently exacerbates addiction rather than alleviating it. But stories like Garrett's can also spark important conversations about solutions. Over the years, advocacy groups and mental health professionals have highlighted how beneficial it can be for child actors to have mandatory counselors on set, regulated work hours that are strictly enforced, and a legal system that prioritizes treatment over prison time for nonviolent drug offenses. The attention garnered by high-profile cases can push forward reforms that protect minors in the industry from exploitation and help them find healthier outlets for the inevitable stress of performing. Even if Garrett himself did not benefit from all these measures, many of which were not in place during his heyday, there's a growing awareness now that young talents need more than just a good contract. They need psychological and emotional safety nets. As for Garrett's own path, glimpses of interviews suggest he's more at peace these days, although life remains far from perfect. He's talked about wanting to tour again, possibly with a new band, and about his hope that fans will give him a second chance, not just as a nostalgia act, but as a mature artist with something real to say. Whether that comeback will take flight is anyone's guess. Hollywood has a short memory, and while fans adore a redemption story, they can also be wary when they've seen too many repeated cycles of downfall and resurrection in the tabloids. Still, Garrett's willingness to own up to his mistakes, especially the tragic car crash that paralyzed his friend, may resonate with people who appreciate honesty and vulnerability. If you're curious about Garrett's more recent endeavors, a quick search reveals he's continued to make guest appearances here and there, sometimes on reality shows, occasionally in interviews that discuss the darker aspects of child stardom. He's now in his early 60s, though you wouldn't necessarily guess that from the older images that still circulate online of the fresh-faced teen idol he once was. Some fan communities remain dedicated, sharing nostalgic videos of him performing songs like Surfin', USA, and I Was Made for Dancin', reminding newcomers that once upon a time this guy lit up TV screens and concert halls. Meanwhile, those who have read his autobiography or followed his legal troubles have a more complicated perception. They see a man who lost his way early on and spent decades trying to find it again. The question of whether Garrett's friend Roland Winkler ever fully forgave him or found closure is another emotional layer to this story. Winkler's life was irrevocably altered by that crash, and though Garrett has publicly expressed remorse, tragedies like that don't just vanish with time. There's also the question of how it shaped Garrett's further behavior. Some argue it propelled him deeper into substance abuse because of the guilt. Others believe it could have been a wake-up call that never fully manifested because the surrounding industry was too lenient, enabling him to continue down a dangerous path. The reality is likely a mix of many factors. According to pieces published by outlets such as People magazine in the 70s and 80s, there was a general sense that child stars who brought in money were shielded from the worst consequences of their actions, at least until the headlines got so big that no one could ignore them. Throughout the 80s and 90s, the image of Garrett as a wholesome teen idol was gradually replaced by the image of a troubled star caught up in repeated controversies. And yet even then, nostalgia has its own power. Fans remember the youthful smile, the catchy tunes, the days when his posters plastered bedroom walls. That collective memory can be surprisingly forgiving, especially decades after the heyday. When Garrett reappears in interviews now, there's a mixture of curiosity. Whatever happened to Leif Garrett? and empathy. Many people who grew up watching him or listening to his music are themselves older now, more aware of life's difficulties, more sympathetic to the notion that fame can twist people's lives into knots. In his autobiography, Garrett delves into the complexities of the entertainment industry, describing how young stars are often pushed to grow up overnight. Agents schedule 14-hour days. Photographers want enticing shots for the next cover, even if it means pushing boundaries. Producers can become father figures, but only insofar as it benefits the project. Real parental guidance sometimes falls by the wayside, overshadowed by the lure of money and the promise of celebrity status. Garrett discusses how the industry taught him to view himself as a commodity from a very young age. When that commodity lost its value, as it did once the headlines turned sour, he felt discarded, which further fueled his resentment and reliance on substances as a way to cope. Such candid reflections have garnered both criticism and praise. Some reviewers felt Garrett was using the book to blame the industry for his personal choices. Others pointed out that while he does place blame on external factors, he also takes responsibility for the role he played in his own decline. Either way, the memoir provides a rare window into the life of a teen idol once considered unstoppable, who came face to face with some of the darkest aspects of human behavior and addiction. In various press appearances promoting the book, Garrett emphasized that he doesn't want to be seen as a victim or a martyr. He wants to be seen as someone who made grave mistakes, hurt people along the way, and is trying to acknowledge that without sugar-coating it. For those who wonder about the possibility of a genuine comeback, Garrett has hinted at new music projects, though details remain sparse. He has also participated in interview-based shows and podcasts where he shares cautionary tales about early fame. Some child stars find a second or third wind later in life. Look at Neil Patrick Harris, who was a teen actor before emerging again as a beloved figure in adulthood, or Drew Barrymore, who overcame early addiction struggles to become a successful producer and talk show host. While Garrett may not be destined for a Hollywood empire like Barrymore's, the door isn't completely shut on him. Niche fan bases are known to rally around older acts they love, and the 70s retro wave has never fully died out. If he releases music or does small tours, it's conceivable that a loyal audience, even if not a massive mainstream one, could support him. Leif Garrett's story is one of immense talent, wasted opportunities, and hard-learned lessons. Like many young stars, he was thrust into fame too soon, exposed to the dangers of Hollywood, and left to navigate its highs and lows on his own. Though his career was derailed by personal struggles, his determination to turn things around in recent years shows that his story isn't over yet. Will he be able to make a true comeback? Only time will tell. What do you think of Leif Garrett's journey? Was he a victim of fame, or were his struggles self-inflicted? Let us know in the comments, and if you love deep dives into the lives of celebrities, don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out more stories of stars who rose and fell in the unpredictable world of Hollywood.